Thank you, Liz Roberts and Richard DeMarco, who I first met as an Edinburgh schoolboy, I think 45 years ago. It's a great pleasure to be here, and as Ian said, I'm going to give a little excerpt out of my book that looks at Sevastopol's wars, which really tries to connect the Russian interest in Crimea generally and the port of Sevastopol specifically from the time of Catherine the Great and Prince Grigory Potemkin. And I have to say this, I came up with the title Sevastopol's Wars, Crimea from Potemkin to Putin before the events of 2014. So I can say that I had a little bit of a prior warning, but nonetheless, we'll see how we get on with this. Sevastopol, a little bit of geography, just making the point that Ian's already trailed for me. Southwest corner of the Crimea, one of the world's greatest anchorages. And there you see one of the early 19th century forts, Fort Constantine, still guarding the entrance to Sevastopol's great harbour, equal, if not greater, than the one at Malta or in Sydney, Australia. And of course, Crimea, generally, and Sevastopol specifically, came back into the news in 2014, which is not the subject of my talk today, but there are some important threads. For most British people, if they've heard of Sevastopol, it would be the so-called siege, or Crimean War, and then maybe a bit about the Second World War, and maybe a little bit about the Yalta Conference and Winston Churchill and the rest of it. But that's just background. But what is common to this is the importance of Sevastopol to Russia as the naval bastion for the Black Sea. And in some ways, you've got to regard it as Russia's Portsmouth or Plymouth and Falmouth put together. It's a bay of bays, and an interesting Scottish connection is that Sevastopol was founded in June 1783 under the precise instructions of Grigory Potemkin by a Russian Scot, Thomas Mackenzie, born in Arkhangelsk in 1740 to Scottish parents. Both he and his father served in the Royal Navy. He had made his name commanding a fireship at the Great Battle of Chesma, had sailed in many senses close to the wind with the Russian Navy, but nonetheless was rehabilitated for the Crimean operation of 1783. And Mackenzie's name survives to the the range of hills around Sevastopol, the Mackenzie Heights, which are famous to military historians of both the Crimean War and the Second World War. And there's Mackenzie there. And his crews opened up a number of important bays. And I just want to mention one of those numbered bays here because the name features shortly in our story, Matyushenko. Matyushenko, of course, is one of the great participants of the Potemkin Mutiny. So his name survives in the bays of Sevastopol. Sevastopol Harbour, then and now, remains hugely important to Russia, and built up slowly during the early 19th century, and was a very, very, as Ian has trailed, a very, very beautiful city. Neoclassical architecture, white colonnades, a real pearl in the Russian Imperium. But long before the naval mutinies of 1905, Sevastopol experienced its first major revolt. It was an outbreak of the bubonic plague in 1830 that led to an insurrection of sailors, soldiers, and townspeople, later known in Russian history as the cholera riots. And as was the way in Sevastopol's brief revolt was put down with great ferocity. In fact, it was Count Mikhail Vorontsov, who's the Governor General of South Russia, brought troops quickly there. 1,500 people were brought to trial. 7 mutineers were sentenced to death, given public executions in 1830. 3 different parts of Sevastopol to reinforce in the public eye the restoration of law and order. Now, of course, by later standards of Tsarist, Bolshevik, or Soviet reaction to such disorder, the authorities were relatively lenient. I now want to fast forward, skip over the Crimean War and its legacy to the Black Sea Fleet of 1905 and the mutiny, the first of the 2 mutinies I'll describe, which is aboard the battleship Prince Potemkin of Tauris, Tauridia, Crimea. This was a very brand new ship, 13,500 tons, 1904, what's known as a pre-dreadnought, because it was the latest generation before the revolutionary British design of dreadnoughts changed naval architecture. But the Black Sea Fleet was a sad place in 1905. Many of the best officers and crews had been transferred to the Pacific and Baltic squadrons, and they tragically got caught up in the Russo-Japanese War, and most of them never returned. But life for the ordinary sailors of the Russian Navy at the time was, let's be blunt, harsh. They were badly administered, inadequately fed, oppressive discipline, and their time off duty was limited. Sailors in Sevastopol were forbidden to smoke in public, eat in restaurants, attend the theatre, ride a tram, or sit in any train compartment other than third class. A warning sign at Sevastopol's Primorsky Boulevard: no dogs and lower ranks allowed. This typified the social apartheid of the time. So indeed, it's almost inevitable with the upsurge of revolutionary, social democratic, and then Bolshevik thinking, which was going through Russia, much of it propaganda material carried on the railways and word to mouth, that in Sevastopol was one of the starting points of the 1905 revolution. A sailors' revolutionary group called the Centralka called for nothing less than the end of Tsarism, and it planned a mass mutiny on the 21st of June 1905. But before the mutiny could take place, some of the Centralka's leader, one of which was Afanasy Nikolaevich Matyushenko, and he was the leader of the subsequent Potemkin mutiny. The battleship, before the mutiny across the whole fleet could get underway, it's not sure whether the authorities had any inkling of this. Anyway, the battleship sailed out of Sevastopol Harbour and steamed towards Tendra Island off the Ukrainian coast in order to test fire her guns. A torpedo boat brought supplies from Odessa, and on the 14th of June 1905, the crew of the Potemkin discovered maggots in rotten meat and refused the soup made with this meat. And when ordered to consume this disgusting broth against their wishes, the crew declined. And then a fateful overreaction took place. So outraged, the second commander of the ship, Ippolit Gilyarovsky, threatened to execute on the spot those who had refused their food. And from now on, this whole incident picks up a momentum which was then to feature hugely in subsequent propaganda and in what we would now call information operations. Of course, it leads to, as already alluded to, the famous Eisenstein film of 1925, Battleship Potemkin. So what happens, of course, is that there is an armed standoff involving the captain, Golikov, the second command, and these crewmen, and there is Matyushenko circled. By any accounts, he was a very hard nut individual. what happened is that there is the officers and the mutineers engage on the quarterdeck of the ship, and the second in command of the mutineers, one Grigory Vakulinchuk, is mortally wounded, and he becomes immortalized in this whole history of the Potemkin mutiny. Nonetheless, the crew, the mutinous crew, seize the ship, kill most of the officers, throw them overboard, which becomes a habit later on during the Civil War and Revolution, and steam for Odessa. At Odessa, there is an insurrection there, and you'll recognize the famous Richelieu steps, of course, which has the iconic scenes from the Eisenstein film, as shown here. Again, this is the important incident. The Potemkin mutiny then becomes magnified much later on and becomes very much part of the historic tradition of the Bolshevik struggle. So that, in very brief summary, is the Potemkin mutiny. Well known, and most people have heard of it. But I now want to turn to a much bigger event, which is far less known, that actually takes place in the heart of Sevastopol's harbour, the mutiny on the armoured cruiser Ochakov. And it involves an individual called Pyotr Petrovich Schmidt, who enters our story and part of the mythology of the 1905 revolution. He's a career officer of the Imperial Russian Navy, a senior lieutenant, not a member of the Social Democrats or the Bolsheviks, but something excites him at the time. Maybe it was what happened on the Potemkin, we're not sure. But he starts to speak publicly with the citizens of Sevastopol, with the ship's crews, and becomes effectively a leader. And in a manner reminiscent of the Parisian mob storming of the Bastille in 1789, an angry crowd of Sevastopolians, citizens and sailors alike, storm the city prison. Troops blocking their path, because Sevastopol was also an army garrison as well as a naval one, machine-gunned them, and there were numbers killed. And now, again, a sort of rather predictable set of events happen. And the Schmidt makes another important speech at the funeral of the shot protesters, which again further raises the temperature of the revolutionary spirit. And Schmidt's speech on the 20th of October 1905 acts as a clarion call for the revolution of 1905 in Sevastopol. And this is what Schmidt said. Next to a coffin, one should say only prayers. Let words of love and a sacred oath become a prayer which we now all offer. We avow that we will never surrender even the smallest portion of our hard-won rights. We affirm that we shall sacrifice all our work, soul, and lives to preserve our freedom. This we hereby swear. And of course, that's repeated through the crowds and is printed out. Unsurprisingly, almost after he's spoken those words, he's arrested by the city and state authorities, who then have to decide what to do with him. But they decide, I think, to cool the temperature of the revolution, to release him, which seems to them a sensible thing to do, but actually gives Schmidt a new burst of revolutionary activity. And then as another mutiny breaks out in November at the Lazarev Naval Barracks, and soon a couple of thousand sailors have grabbed weapons, and it's a much better organized event than the rather opportunistic seizure of the battleship Potemkin. Remember, I say that Centralka had planned a much larger mutiny. This is the big mutiny which preceded the Potemkin mutiny, is now happening. The commander of the Black Sea Fleet, Vice Admiral Chugnin, telegraphed the Tsar personally, Nicholas II, and reported, "Sire, the sailors are in charge here, and all the workers of the dockyard are now joining the Socialist Party," and warning of the gravity of the situation in Sevastopol, he advised the emperor, I quote, "In order to suppress this movement, a great number of troops with artillery will need to be sent here, otherwise we'll be forced to submit to the sailors' demands." So the whole imperial rule in Sevastopol is now on a knife edge. And events took another turn for the worse, and the revolutionaries with Schmidt in command, that's Schmidt here, seize the armored cruiser Ochakov, which was one of the most modern cruisers of the Russian fleet. And it becomes almost as important in our story, if not more so, than the Potemkin. And the revolutionaries elected Pyotr Petrovich Schmidt to be their leader. And Schmidt took his 16-year-old son, Yevgeny, alongside. And it's Yevgeny's account of this that gives us the first-hand description, because as we'll hear shortly, Schmidt comes to an end. Anyway, Schmidt raises the red flag on the Ochakov, and he signals to the fleet, "I command the fleet, Schmidt. I command the fleet." Unfortunately for the mutineers, about half the crews of the Black Sea Fleet remain loyal to the Black Sea Fleet command and to the emperor. So you've got a rather confusing situation of half the ships in the harbour all mixed up are the revolutionary ships and the ships still loyal. And so what's going to happen? Meanwhile, the Russian army garrisons from Simferopol within Sevastopol are massing to take on the mutineers. There is no lack of speedy action by the authorities. And the revolutionaries under Schmidt try to appeal to other crews, to the soldiers, and say, "Join us. The Russian people are with us." But their reply came from other crews, "We serve the Tsar and our motherland, while you are a pirate, and you force under gunpoint people to serve you." Well, Schmidt hadn't given up. He gave more speeches, trying to get the troops who are massing now in Sevastopol onto his side, and he warns the Russian government that he will seize control of Crimea, which of fact was well beyond his capability. He's worried now about cavalry forces advancing, and he in my view, rather aggressively says, "Only the Cossacks represent," everything in Russian history is involved in this, "only the Cossacks represent an obstacle to me." There he is on the crew, and this is on the Ochakov. "For every crack of a Cossack's whip, I will hang one of you, my hostages," because he's got hostages as well, who now make over 100 people. And then he says and announces to the people of Sevastopol, "If your life is precious to you, write to your relations and acquaintances to solicit support of my terms, the removal of troops from this besieged state." Well, his days and hours were now numbered, because he didn't convince the mass of the troops or the remainder of the crews to join him. And so the government authorities then set up artillery within the center of Sevastopol, along the historic boulevard next to the famous Panorama Museum, which had just been opened earlier that year in 1905 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the heroic defense of Sevastopol. And also the coastal guns of the forts all started to direct their fire on the cruiser Ochakov and the smaller destroyers nearby. Yevgeny Schmidt recorded this. The guns of the Rostislav fired at us on the Ochakov, and from the north the second blow came from the fortress artillery. Salvo followed salvo every 5 to 10 seconds. And then he goes on, and during the fight, that Ochakov received 52 hits from large caliber guns, and machine guns from the quays swept our decks. So the days were running, the hours were running out. And then, much to Schmidt's embarrassment, the crew, the revolutionaries, fled like a herd of mad animals whom his father vainly tried to control. They jumped into the water to escape the ferocious fire, only to be machine-gunned mercilessly. So most of the revolutionaries were killed in the water in the Bay of Sevastopol. Well, I won't go on with the detail of what happened because, as you might now imagine, Schmidt is arrested, and he's taken, and this is a piece of really Russian historic irony, he's taken to the fortress of Ochakov, which had been stormed as a Turkish Ottoman fortress in 1788, had been stormed by Potemkin with his best general, Alexander Suvorov. And here's the statue to Suvorov is there, Ochakov still. No statue, I have to say, to Potemkin. So he's taken to the city, the fortress, with the name of the cruiser in which he had mounted his revolution. And this is obviously very close to the name Potemkin, which of course is the earlier revolutionary ship. So all these things come together on the fortress of Ochakov, where he is tried. He's not given any clemency, as you might imagine. An example is made of the revolutionaries who have surrendered. But the authorities give Schmidt an opportunity to write a few last thoughts before his execution. And he's given just a couple of seconds to write down his final thoughts before he's taken to the nearby island of Berezan to be shot. And he writes to preserve for posterity his last words: "In my last minute, I shall think, long live the Russian Tsar," which is quite an unusual thing to say, but here, long live the coming people's representatives. Long live rejuvenated, mighty, happy, and free Russia. And he and his colleagues were taken out to be shot, captured here in a French newspaper at the time, to which many years later, the Soviet memorial with a plaque to the shot mutineers was erected. There are many memorials throughout the former Soviet Union to Schmidt. There's one here in Odessa, and there's another one in Sevastopol, which was erected not obviously during Tsarist times, but in the 1920s. I won't go into the aftermath of the 1905 revolution and the Tsar's October Manifesto, but I'd just like to quote a couple of the reactions amongst the press, etc., to the execution of Schmidt. Some people, this is a bit of a presage of what would happen later in the Soviet Union, they just questioned, they felt sorry for Schmidt. Obviously, he was a mentally sick person for trying to take on, with relatively small numbers, the combined navy and army in the Crimea. And then others, there are critical opinions, of course, and in the brief period after the 1905 revolution, where many thought that there were good times to come, a Simferopol newspaper, Trud, or work, wrote, "Many heroes were born in the revolution, but we cannot call the traitor Schmidt a hero. He spoilt the lives of hundreds of people. He ran away from the Ochakov when under shell fire, leaving those whom he initially led. Revolution gives birth to heroes, but this is how she prepares for death." And last thing I'd say is the memorials to the 1905 revolution and to the Ochakov mutiny remain in Sevastopol, but one small episode in a city that from time to time has dominated the news events of the world, and I would predict that it will remain part of the Russian Emporium, whatever your views can happen in 2014. Sevastopol is part of the soul of Russia, and if you would like to read more, there's something in the book about it. And for those who are interested in trains, like Ian, I don't know whether you saw the armoured train.
I did.
And I'm a great fan. I travel wherever I can in Russia and Ukraine by train as well. And as a military engineer, the trains are important. Yes, exactly, the Marshrutka. Yes, yeah. Anyway, but the irony, of course, it's the railway that brings the revolutionaries and the propaganda to Sevastopol in 1905, and it's the railway that sustains them. There we are, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, I could talk for a lot longer, but I'm very conscious there's another speaker to follow me, Ian.
Right, well...
And I would like to close at that point.